Welcome to the Writecast podcast, a podcast to help actors find auditions and book roles. I'm your host, Ashley Scott Myers. Today we have Christopher Showerman, who has had a long career as an actor, and he got his start in the leading role in George of the Jungle 2. We talk about that, how he landed that role, how he got that, and then we also talk about some of his more recent credits and how he's been able to sustain a career over now many decades. So stay tuned for that interview. If you want my free guide, 5 ways to find auditions and get cast, just go to www.thewritecast.com/guide. Put in your email address and we'll send you the guide for free. We cover a wide range of topics in the guide to help you find opportunities, from booking theater auditions, going to Hollywood for pilot season, how to create a professional self-tape, how to find voiceover gigs in your town or city, how to find acting opportunities or indie and student films in your local area. The guide can certainly be helpful to any actor at any level, but we're putting an emphasis on trying to help actors who are outside of Hollywood. Again, if you'd like to get the free guide, just go to www.thewritecast.com/guide. So now let's dig into our interview with Christopher Showerman. Here is the interview. Welcome, Christopher, to the Writecast podcast. I really appreciate you coming on the show with me today.
Thank you so much, Ashley. It's an honor to be here. Cheers.
So to start out, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up and how did you get interested in the entertainment business?
Well, I was born in Michigan and grew up in a very rural area, which was idyllic for nurturing an imagination, and started out wanting to be a dinosaur. So once that looked like it wasn't going to happen, I started looking to more practical careers, like acting, because it's so much more practical.
Yeah. And you can play a dinosaur.
I could play a dinosaur, exactly. So I can maybe have my Tyrannosaurus and eat it too. So when I was 5, I was in my first play, and I wasn't even quite sure what was going on, but I knew that I liked all that adulation, and I liked being able to be something that I wasn't or felt like I couldn't be. So that was kind of cool, to become something that I wasn't. It was just sort of an extension of playtime. It was an extension of making. Yeah.
And what were some of the first steps? So it sounds like you kind of had this calling to be a performer. What were some of the first steps to actually turning it into a career? Were you a theater major in college? Did you do some short films? What were sort of some of those early first steps?
Well, I went to college for music, actually, which is, again, still performing. So I went for music composition, and I was playing rock music with bands around. That was my performance in my late teens and early 20s. And I was doing little productions, community productions along the way. But in my early 20s, I kind of made that switch to go, well, I don't want to depend on other people. And in the way that I'm approaching the music business, I have to depend on a lot of other people creatively to move forward. And with any endeavor in the arts, you have to depend on other people. But creatively, it's nice if you can sort of sink or swim based on your own efforts. So I figured acting was a better venue for me. So I still love writing and making music on my own, but yeah, acting became my drive.
Gotcha. So at what point you got out of college? At what point did you make the move to Los Angeles? Maybe we can talk about that a little bit. I know this is a topic a lot of actors that, are looking to get into the business. Do you have to act from outside of LA? So maybe just talk about your story and then we can kind of get your perspective.
Perfect. Well, I stayed in Michigan until my mid-20s, and I was doing, once I decided I really wanted to pursue this, I was doing a lot of community theater. I was doing, any possible performance through local colleges and stuff. And when I realized, for me anyway, and this was in the 90s, realized I feel like the only places that I could be to truly pursue this, to truly give it a fair shake, was either New York or Los Angeles. And I thought the weather's better in LA, so I'm coming out to LA. So when I moved out here, it was an overwhelming step, but I knew it was one that had to be taken, to go from a tiny little village of under 1,000 people to literally millions and millions of people, where you're less than a minnow in an ocean of talent. And so it was a big, scary step. And I would tell most people that, and that's changed a little bit since I did it. So LA is not the only game in America now. There's LA and New York, but there's also Atlanta's really become a big hub for entertainment if you wanted to get into that kind of entertainment. Chicago has always been great for live entertainment, and some production is happening there as well. So there's a lot of options, but LA is still kind of the capital of TV movie production.
Gotcha. And I'm curious, obviously there's a lot of production taking place in, Louisiana, you mentioned Atlanta, but as an actor, can you get cast? Like if you're an actor in Atlanta, isn't most of the casting still being done here in LA and then they're shooting in these Canada or Louisiana or Atlanta?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And yes and no. So yes, if you're all of the principal cast or most of the principal cast for all those movies is still getting imported from LA. But it's a great place to be a local hire if you want to break in and say get a few credits on your resume for under fives and maybe featured work. And definitely I started doing extra work, and that's a great place to go to get that on-set experience, even if you don't have any lines, but you're on set with the other actors and actually watching the magic from behind the scenes getting made. So I think that's an excellent part of your education.
Yeah. And do you have any tips for people that are living in these outside of LA? How would they become a local hire? Are there local casting directors you would try and contact? How does one find these local hire opportunities?
Yeah, that's a good question. And there's a couple of different routes to it. So if you wanted to go, I think the most immediate way to just get on set, and some people look down their noses at this, but if you were just wanted to get on set and learn, which is what I did, and I thought it was invaluable, I'd say do background work, do extra work. And to do that, all you have to do is find an extras casting agency and sign up with them. And they're constantly looking for people and for those of you that don't know, being an extra is like being a human prop in the background of the scene.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of a thankless job, but you get paid for it, you get fed, and you get to, most importantly, you get to see how movies get made, the etiquette on set. You get to watch great actors do their thing and see what it really looks like and what it really feels like in the moment when the director says action. So I think for me, that was one of the most important things that I did early on in my career was just get on set.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm
I'm
curious, when I first moved to LA in the mid 90s, I did the same thing. I moved here really to be a writer, but it was the same thing. I would run into people, do some extra work. And it was Central and Cenex casting back then. And this was really before even they had sort of online stuff. So are those services still out there? Is that what if someone rolls into LA, is it still Central and Cenex casting?
I think, well, because that's what it was when I started too. I started with Cenex because they were the
SAG version.
Right? Cenex was non-union, and then Central was
that's right. Yeah.
I believe that whole thing is folded into one now, so it's all just Central Casting, and they have a non-union and union version of it.
Gotcha.
And I'm pretty sure Central is still the Mac Daddy of them all, but it's been a while since I've looked into that. But I'm sure no matter where you are, if you just typed into a search for extra casting or background casting in my area, you'd find the closest casting there.
Yeah, that's a good tip. So let's get back to your move to LA a little bit. I'm just curious what you landed here with. Did you have some contacts? It sounds like you were doing some theater outside of LA. You were sort of building your acting resume. Did you have an agent and manager when you moved here? Did you have some other, at this point, did you know some other actors? And where did you land? I always get that. Where should someone go? Should you go to Silver Lake, Santa Monica? I ended up in the Valley. Someone gave me that advice, and I felt it was good advice because you were still pretty well located, but it was pretty expensive. But let's talk about your experience. What's sort of your advice? What was your experience, and what's your advice to people moving here?
Yeah, great question. When I came, I went to Santa Monica. I knew literally one person. I knew one guy, and he was in the music scene. He was great help. Introduced me to a lot of people who you just start to meet people. The best thing for me as far as starting to feel settled into a community was taking acting classes, because then I met people that were interested in doing the same thing I was doing. We'd talk about, who's your agent, or who are you trying to get repped by, or do you know anybody that might take a meeting with me? Because I had none of that. I had a lot of misinformed ideas about how easy it might be to get an agent and a manager. Well, I figured I'd have that inside a month, and 18 months later, I got my first non-union agent. So it's a slog, but yeah, you got to keep at it.
Gotcha. So let's talk about that, getting that first agent. What did you do? You got here to LA. Did you start sending in headshots to agents? And then ultimately, how did you land that first agent?
I did exactly that. Back when I was starting, there was only one way to do it. You had to get your headshot. It was black and white. You got to print it up on an 8x10 piece. You had to get it reproduced at one of these, reproduction places. And then you just start it's very expensive how we did it back then. You just start mailing it out you would get a list back when we had the bookstore Samuel French. You could get a list of all the agents, and there might be a little blurb about what they specialize in. Like, you wouldn't want to send your headshot to a literary agent because that'd be a waste of their time. But you would send them to as many agents as you thought was appropriate that you could afford to, all the postage and all the extra stuff to send all that. And that was kind of my job as I saw it early on. I would have stacks of headshots that I'd put in envelopes, and I'd spend hours and hours just blind submitting. And your success rate for that is, or at least mine, was extremely low. And I think you have to expect that. If I got a 2% callback rate, then I was pretty happy with that.
Yeah. And so then you would just keep sending these things out. You would go in for auditions. Some of them would say no thanks, and then eventually you were able to find this first agent, just really through the brute force method, it sounds like.
It was total brute force. And my first agent was this sweetheart of a guy that was down in Costa Mesa. And I think he had a lot of non-union talent. And he gave me, he was my first agent, and, got a few auditions for me to get me going. And I think I got my first gig through that agency, which was a small, nothing, one line thing, but it was great. I felt like I was finally plugged in.
Gotcha. So let's talk about some of these first credits. I noticed you did a couple of shorts early on, Frank and Babe, Jack of All Trades. I also noticed you got the a feature film called Dump. I actually know Oliver Robbins and actually just directed him, in a movie that I did last year. So I'm sort of well versed on his stuff. But let's talk about those first credits. How did you get those first credits, sort of before George of the Jungle, just scratching away? How did you get those, and what did it take?
Yeah, well, it's a numbers game. You do as many auditions. You never say no to an audition. I do as many as I can, and sooner or later, you're just going to be right for a role. You can't take the no's as a personal slight to you, because there's so many of them. You have to develop a thick skin, because there's going to be a lot more rejection than there is acceptance in it. But yeah, you just happen to fall into the right place. And Oliver's project was the first actual movie that I got to do. And I'm excited that you worked with him, because I haven't seen Oliver in 18, 20 years. And he was so lovely back then. And Oliver is a great example too of brute force, because he was actually quite successful early on as a young actor, and took that money. I know, at least for the story of Dumped that he told at the time, he took some of the money that he made as a successful child actor and put it into the stock market and became a day trader. And so he just kept pounding the market until he had enough profit to pull it out and make Dumped. So he made that all with money that he had won on the stock market, basically.
Yeah, for sure. So let's get into George of the Jungle sequel a little bit. How did that come about? Maybe you can sort of walk us through that process and how you got cast in that.
I'd like to say it was all sheer talent and good looks that got me George of the Jungle. But honestly, and I think this is the case with any big break like that, there is an amazing amount of luck that goes into landing something when you're a nobody. I was a no name. I had very few credits outside of Oliver's movie behind me. So I had an agent at the time, and I told him that I'd heard that this opening for the sequel of George of the Jungle was opening up. He tried to get me in. He couldn't get me in. I said, fine, I'm going to shoot the audition myself. And this was long before the idea of self-tapes came up. So I'd got my hands on the audition material. And then I called all my friends and I said, we're going to treat this like a short film. I want to shoot the most theatrical audition possible. I want to stage it. I want to put it out. We're going to get out in the woods, and I'll make a loincloth, and we'll make our own little mini movie. And this is going to be my audition. I'm going to shoot this like I was shooting a scene from the movie. Well, the night before we were going to go do this, the night before we were going to shoot this, I got a call from a friend of mine who said, hey, I've got a buddy who is an agent at CAA, which is a creative artists agency, which is the biggest, the juggernaut of agencies of LA, of the movie industry. And he said, would you like to meet her? I said, oh my God, of course, I'd love to meet her. So we postponed filming this audition. I went in, I met her. Her name is Jenny Rawlings, and Jenny and I had a great conversation about everything but entertainment. So we talked about education, and we talked about, the state of whatever, kids and traffic. And then at the very end of it, I thought, oh my gosh, I just had this meeting with this super powerful agent. And I didn't say anything about, and I hate self-promoting, but right as I was walking into the elevator, I said, oh, so anyway, Jenny, I see myself as a cross between Superman and George of the Jungle. And then the elevator doors closed, and I'm like, oh, that was the worst way to end that. About 45 minutes later, Jenny calls me, and she said, I realize I'm not your agent, but I do know the casting director for that new George of the Jungle movie. If you would like to go in, I'd love to send you in on it. And so that was the beginning of the major miracle that allowed me the opportunity. Of course, I canceled my own shoot with that I was going to shoot my own audition, and then I got to go in and see Amy Lippens, who was doing the casting for George of the Jungle. And the rest is kind of history.
And it sounds like, though, there was definitely some preliminary. I mean, you were obviously familiar with the first movie. I mean, you kind of are posing it like it was kind of just luck, but there was a lot of things happening. I mean, you were submitting to these agents for many years. I mean, you know what I'm saying? There was a lot of groundwork that had been laid by the time you sort of got in this sort of position.
Absolutely. And luck alone won't do anything for you in the industry. It takes so much sweat. Anybody that you see that's an overnight success, don't believe it. They have worked their tail off to get to where they are. They may have also been, well, they would have had to have been incredibly lucky. We all have to be lucky to move forward in life. But there's so much preparation that goes into any kind of success in this. And so, yes, I had done a lot of hustling just to get to that point. And I happened to be in the right place at the right time. My friend happened to put me in touch with the right person that had the contacts. So all that was luck. But then if I showed up to the audition and looked like an idiot in front of the casting director, that luck would have all been for naught. So you have to have the preparation, or else luck does nothing for you.
Yeah. And I'm curious, I try and give my listeners sort of a real good idea of sort of the scope of what's going on. As you were talking about preparing for this pretty sophisticated audition tape, I was wondering, is this something that, obviously that one got canceled and it still worked out, but was this something you had done before? Did you do it with other projects? And I feel like in the entertainment industry, we all concentrate on the successes, but we don't realize that to get that one success, there might be 10 or 20. Like you might have done this 10 or 20 times, but we don't necessarily talk about that because it didn't result in the kind of success that, George of the Jungle did. So were you doing this with other things, these really elaborate self-tape projects to kind of get in there?
What great insight. And I'm glad that you're sharing this. It's true. I actually had not done anything quite this to this degree of elaborate before. But I had been making little movies with my friends. We'd done little things. So we were sort of in the rhythm of making projects that we knew were for no other reason than we liked doing this and we wanted to get better at it. So it was kind of practice in front of the camera. But when this audition came along, or when this possible opportunity came along, I decided to throw all my eggs in that basket. I thought, you know what, this is something worth losing sleep over. And so I really I was ready to put some money into it. I ended up, like you said, it was canceled. So I didn't do this elaborate audition, but I was ready to go full out. Like this was going to be another little mini movie. This was going to be the best mini movie that me and my friends had made up to this point.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there is a lot of sort of ramping up to get to the point where you go, sure, I'm not afraid to make a mini movie for an audition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I'm curious, how did this change the trajectory of your career? Once this movie, you were the lead and, a pretty big movie. How did that then change things for you? Did you level up, you obviously now CAA, it sounds like you signed with CAA, but how did it change the trajectory of your career overall?
Well, it changed everything and also changed nothing kind of at the same time. So I knew that this was a huge break for me. And so I was ready for everything to dramatically change. We all have these ideas of what success is going to look like. And after I'd shot George of the Jungle, I was hip pocketed by Jenny. So I wasn't officially a client at CAA. The way that they work, all of the agents have to agree on you before they take you on as a client. And I was still, even though I'd done this George movie, I was still a nobody. Nobody knew my name. I wasn't a household name. And Jenny decided to just take me under her wing as a pet project. And for the next 6 months, she hustled hard to get me into meetings that I wouldn't have otherwise gotten into. And I thought, this is it. Here we go. Buckle up because it's going to be exciting and successful. And after 6 months, I'll be honest, there wasn't a lot of interest in me. And agents or casting agents would meet me and they're like, yeah, I don't know. He's a nice guy. I don't really feel it. He's not magical. And that was devastating. I mean, and Jenny saw that and she's like, well, look, I'm a businesswoman. I can't waste time on somebody the casting directors don't love. So I kind of got ghosted. But that was the end of my CAA experience. So that was it. And so I went from this, the sky's the limit to, oh my gosh, I just had this huge opportunity and I feel like it's over. I feel like it's wasted or squandered. Mm-hmm. And that can play a lot with your psyche and with your self-worth. And I totally understand, although I've, knock on wood, I've been very lucky not to have any issues with addiction or messing with illicit drugs. I have a lot of compassion for people in the spotlight that do fall into that trap because I get it now. I didn't get it before, but I get it now because it's very hard to go through that kind of emotional roller coaster all on your own because you get slammed around like you're in the spin cycle of a washing machine. And it's a mind game that is hard to explain to anybody that's not been through it before. Mm-hmm. But luckily, I got on the other side of that and realized, you know what? George of the Jungle is a huge asset because it's the beginning of a conversation, just like this conversation. Mm-hmm. It's the beginning of talking about other things. And from that, I've gotten to do some amazing projects that I never would have been considered for before, simply because I was able to start a conversation with a known entity, in this case, George of the Jungle.
Gotcha. So let's talk about some of your more recent credits. And what I thought would actually be kind of interesting would be for you to just tell us, how did you get cast in that project? And I picked out sort of two, they're going to seem random to you, but I picked out Astro and Enter the Fire. And the reason I picked those is because I'm familiar with those projects. Astro, I actually had the writer-director on my other screenwriting podcast, so I'm familiar with that. And I've worked with Ian Lauer, who was the star of Enter the Fire. So I'm a little bit familiar with that project as well. How did you get cast in those two projects? And just sort of walk through them, just so we kind of get a feel for sort of how these things actually transpire.
Absolutely. Okay, well, let's start with the Seeps project. So, and I'm excited that you spoke to him. That's cool that you had him on the show. Yeah. So Seep is a lovely guy. I met him through, originally, I have a movie called Radio America, and at the time, Asif was working with another guy, and they were putting together distribution deals, and we almost did a distribution deal with those guys. We ended up going in a different direction, but the relationship was forged, and I really liked Asif. He's a sweetheart of a guy, and he's always been very, very thoughtful of me. Like whenever he has a project, he would call me up and say, "Hey, Chris, I've got a day of work if you want it, or I've got 2 days if you want to come hang with us and do this project. And I always have fun on his sets. And so I always say yes. And I always do have fun, and I meet amazing people. So, and Astro was no different, except Astro was shot, that particular project was shot in Roswell, New Mexico, which was a double-edged sword. It was perfect for shooting a science fiction movie out there. A little bit of a challenge travel-wise, and so I think was a nightmare for him as a director and for his first AD that was trying to keep the train on the tracks. For that. But all in all, he manages to make something out of everything. He is such a he has such a strong work ethic that he's not going to let up until he's got. And then the movie that I did with Ian, Enter the Fire, so much fun. I was able to get that because I had worked with Phil Gorn. Phil Gorn was the writer-director of that project. And again, I said yes to a nothing role to Phil years before. And that was a problematic movie for Phil, but I was easy to work with. I was fun. I liked, I made the director feel like I wanted to tell his story. I was not a problem on set. And Phil and I developed a good relationship from that. So again, out of the blue, Phil calls me up and said, "Hey, I have this project." It doesn't happen often, but with Phil, he'll call me up and say, "Hey, I have this project. Would you like to play this role?" It makes it sound like I never do auditions at all, which is so not true. I do auditions all the time and rarely get them. But in this case, Phil just gave me the role. He said, "You're going to be playing the brother of this muscly guy, and I think that you guys could work well together." And of course, I met Ian, and we ended up absolutely falling in love. I think he's just a sweetheart of a guy, and he's wholesome and upstanding and good human being. And so it was not hard to develop this brotherly relationship. We play brothers in the movie, and there's a lot of sibling banter and rivalry in it. And it was like the real thing when I was hanging out with Ian so much. So that's how that movie came about.
Gotcha. So what's interesting listening to you, and I know there probably is a gazillion auditions, and so we'll talk about that for a minute, but how many of the projects that you get cast in are coming from your agent? How many of them nowadays, like let's say over the last 5 or 10 years, how many of your projects have come through this sort of networking and just beating the bush and being good on set and working with people a second and third time versus just sort of an audition sent out from your agent? What percentage of the projects are actually you finding the work?
Honestly, I'd say that 80% of what I get to do and closer to 100% of the really marquee stuff that I get to do come through relationships. And like I said, I'm constantly auditioning. I'm constantly getting rejected from those auditions. And I rely on my agents and manager very much because they're amazing, and they get me out, and they help me to develop relationships with the casting directors. But a lot of the movies, and especially the independent movies that I've had, it's not that big of a world. And so once you're in it for a while, you start to see the same people, and not only your talent's very important, and everybody should be working on their craft constantly. I still go to acting class every week because I'm constantly wanting to be better and to be a stronger actor. So you should always work on your craft. But honestly, the relationships that I've developed, people work with people they like. And when I directed, I have not done a lot of directing, but when I directed, that was one of the huge elements. It's like, do I want to spend 12 hours a day for several weeks on set with this person? Do they feel like they're going to play ball with me? And I think going into this, you have to realize that it's, for what we see in People Magazine and TMZ, that it might be a prima donna world. And it's absolutely not, especially if you're trying to break in. You have to be a collaborator and work with people. You have to be nice, prompt, professional, on time, prepared, and that will go a lot longer with people that know you than just knowing that you can do the monologue from Henry V.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. What tools do you use to try and find some auditions on your own? Do you breakdown services? I use that, for my Actors Access. Are there some tools that you can recommend for actors that are maybe new to the scene? What do you use? And maybe even if you don't use it, maybe there's some things that you recommend to young actors as you meet them.
Yeah, another great question. I probably don't have the best answer for that. I use Actors Access as well. And they constantly update me on things that they think roles they think might generally fit me based on the information that I put in there. But then that's a little like online dating. It's like it's a pretty wide net that you're casting. Mm-hmm. So it's like a white guy, an old white guy, then I fit the bill. But you don't know if that's going to be fit your taxonomy. Mm-hmm. your specific energy that you bring to anything. And I think, maybe an answer to your question, that would be my answer, is a great tool that I came across wasn't so much in connecting with the casting directors or the job opportunities, but I took a course in really discovering what other people saw when they looked at me. So understanding what I just, without trying, what I happen to have when I walk into a room. And I think every actor needs to know. Like, for instance, if you go, I don't understand it. I'm such a nice guy, and I walk into these auditions to play a nice guy, and I never get cast. Well, this would be the opportunity to go, well, a stranger will look at you and think that you're a serial killer. Let's say. And that's your taxonomy, we call that, or that's sort of your essence or your whatever. Now, you may be the nicest guy in the world, but if people look at you and they see a serial killer, you have to embrace that and go, awesome. I need to start finding all those roles where they're looking for this darkness that I don't feel like I have, but people just see that in me. So I'm gonna embrace that. Or maybe people see you as a geek, or the guy next door, or the best friend. Find out what your essence is, and then try to magnify that as much. And I think that you'll find that your hit rate, I won't say skyrockets, because there is no skyrocketing, mm-hmm. But it will definitely go up exponentially once you realize what people see before you even open your mouth.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent tip. I mean, it's got to be emotionally very painful, and a lot of times people don't always see themselves exactly how other people see them. But you're right, having that self-awareness could be very valuable.
Exactly.
So let's just talk about just some basic sort of things, tools or things that actors are going to need, like headshots. I know when I got here in the 90s, it was exactly what you're saying. You got the sort of the printed headshot. Now when actors audition, they seem to have 4 or 5 different looks. You go on Actors Access, look at the page, they might have 20 different headshots. What do you recommend for actors, and how do they find a good photographer, and what should they expect to pay for a good photographer taking headshots for them?
Yeah. Great question. These are all great questions.
Well, thank you.
Your homework. So again, kind of dovetailing to the thing that we were just talking about, you need your headshot to magnify that thing that you have. If it's a serial killer thing, or if it's the buddy next door, the girl next door, whatever that is, make sure that gets captured in your headshot. I see so many people go off the rails because they want their headshot to be them looking their best. You want to look, this would be the picture that you would want on the cover of Us Magazine when you get the cover of Us Magazine. And that's absolutely the wrong approach for your headshot. Your headshot has to say, I have the specific energy. And if my energy is a serial killer, I want you to see that it's a serial killer and not mistake me for the boy next door. Or I want you, so when you meet with your photographer, make sure that they understand what your essence is, or what you're selling. What is that thing that you have to offer the storytelling world? So what do you have to sell? And then work with your photographer. Hopefully it's an experienced photographer to capture that on film, because that's actually an art form, and it's not easy. It's very difficult to really get an essence on film. And then to your point of how much do you expect to pay for the photographer, you never know. You might get lucky and have your buddy shoot a great shot that just captures who you are because you were comfortable with him and you had all the time in the world. But I find it's worth the money. For me, it's worth the money to spend I spend about $400 or $500 to get a great photographer who understands lighting, who understands angles, understands, if you're casting certain shadows on your body, what are the good shadows, what are the bad shadows? I want that shadow that shows my square jaw, but I don't want that shadow that covers half of my face. So get the photographer that can capture your essence, and it's going to be worth the money. That first job that you book with that headshot is going to be worth the money. And take heart knowing that you don't have to spend the money on getting photo reproductions like Ashley and I did. So,
Yeah.
So you're going to save that money. So spend it on the photographer.
Yeah, gotcha. And what's your take on reels? How do you cut together a reel? How do you find an editor to cut the reel? I noticed when I've been casting the last couple of movies I've done, and I actually like this, where the actors split up their reel. So they might have a dramatic reel and a comedy reel, instead of just lumping it into like 1 6-minute reel, which you don't really have time to watch. But what's your advice on reels? And then ultimately, again, how much do you pay for a reel? And how do you cut yours up? How do you find an editor?
Yes. Great. Back in the day when I didn't have that much material, I threw it all into one reel, and I made that mistake that you just mentioned, which is you make this epically long reel that you and your mom and maybe your cousin is going to watch, and that's it. Nobody in the industry is going to sit down for 6 minutes and watch your whole reel. They don't care, and they don't have the time. Even if they did care, they don't have the time to look at that whole thing. So you need to make that statement of who you are, and again, maximizing your essence in the quickest amount of time possible on that reel. And definitely these days, people have different reels for different, like you said, you have a comedy reel, you have a drama reel, and my agents have suggested, because I have all that, but they've suggested lately, just give us scenes. So we want specific scenes. So I did a scene where in one particular movie, I actually was a serial killer. And they said, okay, we just want that so we can submit that on, because we don't think they're going to watch past one scene anyway. So let us just submit that for the next dark person or mean guy. And then the same thing, if I have something that's comedic, they've asked just to have that specific scene. So it's not even a reel in that case. And then if the casting director, and then the director are interested, if their interest is piqued, they may want to see more. Then you can hit them with a longer reel that has a little bit more of your work in it. But at first, you want to give them as close to what you think they're looking for as you've got. And if that perfect scene is 3 scenes down in your reel, it's not going to get watched. They're not going to make it to that. So just give them that scene to start them off that way. And then if they're interested, they may want to see more of your body work, see more of your range, and do it that way. And then as far as editing the reel, I've always edited my own. I've got some experience editing. I love editing. I think it's some of the most muscle in storytelling happens in the editing room. The editor has power over what finally gets communicated when we tell our stories. So I've really enjoyed being my own editor with that. But it is really important to have somebody who knows what they're doing, so you're not just, cutting these blocky scenes that don't seem to go together, that have no flow, that have no tempo, that are boring, and they don't maximize what your message. You want to always stay on message with your marketing material, which is your headshot, your reels, or your specific scenes that you're sending out.
One thing I noticed in a lot of reels is that actors won't have a lot of material. So they'll take the 2 or 3 scenes they have from the student film and this low budget indie film. And I just always feel like, because the lighting isn't that great. The lens isn't, not when you're cutting together 3 pieces of really low budget content, it doesn't always give you that first thing. Do you have any suggestions for those types of people? Is it okay to cut together this reel that doesn't really look that great? What would you suggest for those folks?
It's a really good point. And from your experience, it's great to hear from your experience too. People need to know that anybody that spent time in the industry is going to know right away if this is a professional gig that you have on your reel, or if it's something that you shot with a flashlight and your iPhone, which is nothing wrong with a flashlight and iPhone if it's in the hands of somebody who really knows what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
But most of us don't, and it shows. And the audio also shows. I feel like audio is 51% of what we're communicating. So you have to spend the money and take the time to get your audio crisp and clean, because that's going to give away a shoddy production as much as anything else. That said, if you've got the money, but you don't have the material to put on your reels, there are a few businesses out there that will put together a better looking. I won't say it will be mistaken for primetime TV, but they can put together a better looking couple of scenes for you that you can use to show that you do have some chops, that you know your craft. And by the way, know your craft before you waste the money on a reel. So you put your best foot forward, and you've got something that really communicates the extent of range that you do have. And don't overreach that range either. Just stay within what you know is solid, what you know can sell. Because you don't want your reel looking like, what was that movie? The Room.
Yeah.
Where you're overreaching what you can really pull off. So there are a couple of businesses, and I think I'm kind of talking off the cuff here, but I believe that would probably run you about $1,500, maybe $2,000 to have a tiny demo reel production company come in and put 2 or 3 of their scenes on tape and light it and edit it for you and run sound and all that.
Gotcha. So what have you been working on? You mentioned at the before we got on the interview, you had a weekly exercise video that you were putting out. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. What is that all about, and how can people find it?
Thank you for asking. Well, during the pandemic, things were very quiet for most of us actors. And I love fitness. I love working out. I try to stay in good shape because I feel like that's part of what I sell as an actor. I have friends that I was working out with during the pandemic, and they wanted to buy some weights because all of our gyms got closed down, and all of the weights, all of the exercise equipment skyrocketed in price. Like a pair of dumbbells was $2,500, ridiculous.
Yeah.
So I started looking into other ways that we could work out together without having to spend a lot of money, because there were no gyms. We had to do it outside. We had to do it on the cheap. We had to be able to maybe travel a little bit to find a space where we could work out. And I tripped upon this idea of using dog leashes, which you can buy for $1 at the dollar store. So if you pay $2, you get yourself 2 dog leashes. You can work your entire body out and actually get an incredible workout, which surprised me as much as anyone. So I started putting these ideas together for my friends and realized if we needed this must be a need that other people feel as well. So I decided to take the time to put together these exercise videos. They're 60 seconds long. They're very fast, hopefully funny, and yet they have worthwhile information in about how to get a workout from a pair of dog leashes. And you can find them on YouTube under The Path of Leashed Resistance.
Gotcha.
Use a dog leash.
Yeah, perfect. And I'll link to those in the show notes. That's very clever. And tell us about your movie. I think you said it was called Double Blood. Tell us about that. How did you get involved with that? You directed it as well?
I didn't direct this one. So Double Blind is a spy thriller movie that was shot in a French New Wave style. My buddy Tom Moser came up with the idea, and he came up with this way where we could shoot. Again, this wasn't through a production company. It was just some pals that got together, came up with what we thought was a very interesting story with a really interesting twist. Not a lot of CGI or special effects. And we did this movie, with spit and gumption and a lot of freebies from all of our friends, and came up with this, I'm pretty proud of this 90-minute movie that just released on Amazon Prime yesterday. So Double Blind is, if you're in the mood for an art house but spy thriller, check out Double Blind, please. Okay,
perfect. Yeah, Double Blind. And again, I'll try and link to that in the show notes over to Amazon Prime. So what's the best way for people to keep up with what you're doing? Twitter, Facebook, obviously the YouTube videos, but is there anything else you're comfortable sharing? And I'll round that up for the show notes as well.
Absolutely. I have a website, ChristopherShowerman.com. I'd love to have you visit there. You can reach out directly to me. I answer all of my email that comes through that website. So if you have any questions, maybe you're interested in getting into this business. I actually really enjoy mentoring people that are interested in doing what I do, and maybe can share some of the mistakes that I made that I want to help you avoid. So if you're interested in that, please reach out to me through my website. You can reach out through Facebook, Christopher Showerman. I don't have a big presence on Twitter. I'm on Instagram now as well, Christopher Showerman. So I'd love to see you all there. Path of Least Resistance is also on Instagram as well.
So perfect. Well, Christopher, I really appreciate you coming on and talking with me today. This is a great interview. I think it's a lot of great tips for up and coming actors.
It was my pleasure and an honor, Ashley. This is fantastic. And I love when I get to talk to somebody that really knows what they're talking about.
Well, I appreciate that.
You're as passionate about what you do as I am about that. And that excites me as well.
Perfect, Christopher. We'll talk to you later.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye. If you enjoyed this interview, do check out my other podcast over at sellingyourscreenplay.com, where I've got hundreds of interviews. They're mostly with producers, directors, and writers, but there are some great interviews with actors as well. But even the episodes with directors, producers, and writers, I think often have a lot of good information in those interviews for actors as well, even if it's just to understand that part of the business better. If you find this episode valuable, please help me out by giving me a review anywhere you find this podcast. You can probably leave a review, iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher, or just retweet it or share it on Facebook. These reviews and shares are very helpful to let the various platforms know what people think of the podcast. And with some good reviews, it can really help get the podcast in front of more people. So if you have a minute and wouldn't mind just leaving a nice review, it would be very much appreciated. That's the show. Thank you for listening.